In this and in the next set of videos, I'd like to tell you about a learning algorithm called a neural network. We're going to first talk about the representation, and then in the next set of videos talk about learning algorithms for it. Neural networks is actually a pretty old idea, but had fallen out of favor for a while, but today it is the state-of-the-art technique for many different machine learning problems. So why do we need yet another learning algorithm? We already have linear regression and we have logistic regression, so why do we need neural networks? In order to motivate the discussion of neural networks, let me start by showing you a few examples of machine learning problems where we need to learn complex nonlinear hypotheses. Consider a supervised learning classification problem where you have a training set like this. If you want to apply logistic regression to this problem, one thing you could do is apply logistic regression with a lot of nonlinear features like that. So here, g as usual is a sigmoid function, and we can include lots of polynomial terms like these. And if you include enough polynomial terms, then maybe you can get a hypothesis that separates the positive and negative examples. This particular method works well when you have only, say, two features, x1 and x2, because you can then include all those polynomial terms of x1 and x2. But for many interesting machine learning problems, we have a lot more features than just two. We've been talking for a while about housing prediction, and suppose you had a housing classification problem rather than a regression problem. Like maybe if you have different features of a house, and you want to predict what are the odds that a house will be sold within the next 6 months. So that would be a classification problem. And as we saw, we can come up with quite a lot of features, maybe 100 different features of different houses. For a problem like this, if you were to include all the quadratic terms, all of these are, even all the quadratic, that is the second order polynomial terms, there would be a lot of them. There'd be terms like x1 squared, x1, x2, x1, x3, x1, x4, up to x1, x100, and then you have x2 squared, x2, x3, and so on. And if you include just the second order terms, that is the terms that are a product of two of these terms, x1 times x4 and so on, then for the case of n equals 100, you end up with about 5,000 features. And asymptotically, the number of quadratic features grows roughly as order n squared, where n is the number of the original features, like x1 through x100 that we had, and is actually closer to n squared over 2. So including all the quadratic features doesn't seem like maybe a good idea, because that's a lot of features, and you might end up overfitting the training set, and it can also be computationally expensive to have to be working with that many features. One thing you could do is include only a subset of these. So if you include only the features x1 squared, x2 squared, x3 squared, up to maybe x100 squared, then the number of features is much smaller. Here you have only 100 such quadratic features, but this is not enough features and certainly won't let you fit a data set like that on the upper left. In fact, if you include only these quadratic features together with the original x1 and so on up to x100 features, then you can't actually fit very interesting hypotheses. You can fit things like axis-aligned ellipses like these, but you certainly cannot fit a more complex data set like that shown here. So 5,000 features seems like a lot. If you were to include the cubic or third order polynomial features, the x1, x2, x3, x1 squared, x2, x10, x11, x17, and so on, you can imagine there are going to be a lot of these features. In fact, they're going to be order n cubed such features, and if n equals 100, you can compute that you end up with on the order of about 170,000 such cubic features. And so including these higher order polynomial features when your original feature set n is large, this really dramatically blows up your feature space, and this doesn't seem like a good way to come up with additional features with which to build nonlinear classifiers when n is large. For many machine learning problems, n will be pretty large. Here's an example. Let's consider the problem of computer vision. And suppose you want to use machine learning to train a classifier to examine an image and tell us whether or not it is the image is a car. Many people wonder why computer vision could be difficult. I mean, when you and I look at this picture, it's so obvious what this is. You wonder how is it that the learning algorithm could possibly fail to know what this picture is. To understand why computer vision is hard, and let's zoom into a small part of the image, like that area where the little red rectangle is. It turns out that where you and I see a car, the computer sees that. What it sees is this matrix, or this grid of pixel intensity values that tells us the brightness of each pixel in the image. So the computer vision problem is to look at this matrix of pixel intensity values and tell us that these numbers represent the door handle of a car. Concretely, when we use machine learning to build a car detector, what we do is we come up with a labeled training set with, let's say, a few labeled examples of cars and a few labeled examples of things that are not cars. Then we give our training set to the learning algorithm, train a classifier, and then we may test it and show the new image and ask, what is this new thing? And hopefully it'll recognize that that is a car. To understand why we need nonlinear hypotheses, let's take a look at some of the images of cars and maybe non-cars that we might feed to our learning algorithm. Let's pick a couple pixel locations in our images. So that's pixel 1 location and pixel 2 location, and let's plot this car at the location at a certain point depending on the intensities of pixel 1 and pixel 2. And let's do this with a few other images. So let's take a different example of a car and look at the same 2 pixel locations, and that image has a different intensity for pixel 1 and a different intensity for pixel 2, so it ends up at a different location on the figure. And then let's plot some negative examples as well. That's a non-car, that's a non-car. And if we do this for more and more examples, using the pluses to denote cars and minuses to denote non-cars, what we'll find is that the cars and non-cars end up lying in different regions of this space, and what we need therefore is some sort of nonlinear hypothesis to try to separate out the two classes. What is the dimension of the feature space? Suppose we were to use just 50 by 50 pixel images. That is, suppose our images were pretty small ones, just 50 pixels on the side. Then we would have 2500 pixels, and so the dimension of our feature size will be n equals 2500, where our feature vector x is a list of all the pixel intensities, the pixel brightness of a pixel 1, the brightness of pixel 2, and so on, down to the pixel brightness of the last pixel, where in a typical computer representation, each of these may be values between, say, 0 to 255, if it gives us maybe the grayscale value. So we have n equals 2500. And that's if we were using grayscale images. If we were using RGB images with separate red, green, and blue values, we'd have n equals 7500. So if we were to try to learn a nonlinear hypothesis by including all the quadratic features, that is, all the terms of the form xi times xj, well, with 2500 pixels, we will end up with a total of 3 million features, and that's just too large to be reasonable. It will be computationally very expensive to find and to represent all of these 3 million features per training example. So simple logistic regression, together with adding in maybe the quadratic or the cubic features, that's just not a good way to learn complex nonlinear hypotheses when n is large, because you just end up with too many features. In the next few videos, I'd like to tell you about neural networks, which turns out to be a much better way to learn complex hypotheses, complex nonlinear hypotheses, even when your input feature space, even when n is large. And along the way, I'll also get to show you a couple fun videos of historically important applications of neural networks as well, that I hope those videos that we'll see later will be fun for you to watch as well. Neural networks are a pretty old algorithm that was originally motivated by the goal of having machines that can mimic the brain. Now, in this class, of course, I'm teaching neural networks to you because they work really well for different machine learning problems, and certainly not just because they're biologically motivated. But in this video, I'd like to give you some of the background on neural networks so that we can get a sense of what we can expect them to do, both in the sense of applying them to modern day machine learning problems, as well as for those of you that might be interested in maybe the big AI dream of someday building truly intelligent machines, also how neural networks might pertain to that. The origins of neural networks was as algorithms that try to mimic the brain, and there was the sense that if we want to build learning systems, well, why not mimic perhaps the most amazing learning machine we know about, which is perhaps the brain. Neural networks came to be very widely used throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and for various reasons its popularity diminished in the late 90s. But more recently, neural networks have had a major recent resurgence. One of the reasons for this resurgence is that neural networks are a computationally somewhat more expensive algorithm, and so it was only, maybe somewhat more recently that computers became fast enough to really run large-scale neural networks. And because of that, as well as a few other technical reasons, which we'll talk about later, modern neural networks today are the state-of-the-art technique for many applications. So when you think about mimicking the brain, well, the human brain does so many amazing things, right? The brain can learn to see, process images, learn to hear, learn to process our sense of touch. It can, learn to do math, learn to do calculus, and the brain does so many different amazing things. It seems like if you want to mimic the brain, it seems like you have to write lots of different pieces of software to mimic all of these different fascinating, amazing things that the brain does. But there's this fascinating hypothesis that the way the brain does all of these different things is not with like 1,000 different programs, but instead the way the brain does it is with just a single learning algorithm. This is just a hypothesis, but let me share with you some of the evidence for this. This part of the brain, that little red part of the brain, is your auditory cortex. And the way you're understanding my voice now is your ear is taking the sound signal and routing the sound signal to your auditory cortex, and that's what's allowing you to understand my words. Neuroscientists have done the following fascinating experiment where you cut the wire from the ears to the auditory cortex, and you rewire, in this case, an animal's brain, so that the signal from the eyes, from the optic nerve, eventually gets routed to the auditory cortex. If you do this, it turns out the auditory cortex will learn to see. And this is in every single sense of the word see as we know it. So if you do this to the animals can perform visual discrimination tasks, and that is, they can look at images and make appropriate decisions based on the images, and they're doing it with that piece of brain tissue. Here's another example. That red piece of brain tissue is your somatosensory cortex. That's how you process your sense of touch. If you do a similar rewiring process, then the somatosensory cortex will learn to see. Because of this and other similar experiments, these are called neural rewiring experiments, there's this sense that if the same piece of physical brain tissue can process sight or sound or touch, then maybe there's one learning algorithm that can process sight or sound or touch. And instead of needing to implement 1,000 different programs or 1,000 different algorithms to do the 1,000 wonderful things that the brain does, maybe what we need to do is figure out some approximation or to whatever the brain's learning algorithm is and implement that, and let the brain learn by itself how to process these different types of data. To a surprisingly large extent, it seems as if we can plug in almost any sensor to almost any part of the brain, and sort of within reason, the brain will learn to deal with it. Here are a few more examples. On the upper left is an example of learning to see with your tongue. The way it works is, this is actually a system called BrainPort, undergoing FDA trials now to help blind people see. But the way it works is you strap a grayscale camera to your forehead facing forward, and that takes a low resolution grayscale image of what's in front of you, and you then run a wire to an array of electrodes that you place on your tongue, so that each pixel gets mapped to a location on your tongue, where maybe a high voltage corresponds to a dark pixel and a low voltage corresponds to a bright pixel. And even as adults today, with this sort of system, you and I will be able to learn to see in tens of minutes with our tongues. Here's a second example of a human echolocation or human sonar. So there are two ways you can do this. You can either snap your fingers or click your tongue. Can't do it very well. And but there are blind people today that are actually being trained in schools to do this and learn to interpret the pattern of sounds bouncing off your environment as sonar. So if after you search on YouTube, there are actually videos of this amazing kid who tragically, because of cancer, had his eyeballs removed. So this is a kid with no eyeballs. But by snapping his fingers, he can walk around and never hit anything. He can ride a skateboard. He can shoot a basketball into a hoop. And this is a kid with no eyeballs. Third example is the haptic belt, where if you have a strap around your waist, a ring of buzzers, and always have the northmost one buzzing, you can give a human a direction sense, similar to maybe how birds can, sense sense where north is. And somewhat bizarre example, but if you plug a third eye into a frog, the frog will learn to use that eye as well. So it's pretty amazing to what extent it's as if you can plug in almost any sensor to the brain, and the brain's learning algorithm will just figure out how to learn from that data and deal with that data. And there's a sense that if we can figure out what the brain's learning algorithm is and implement it or implement some approximation to that algorithm on a computer, maybe that would be our best shot at making real progress towards the AI, the artificial intelligence dream of someday building truly intelligent machines. Now, of course, I'm not teaching neural networks, just because they might give us a window into this far-off AI dream, even though that's one of the things that I personally work on in my research life. But the main reason I'm teaching neural networks in this class is because it's actually a very effective state-of-the-art technique for modern-day machine learning applications. So in the next few videos, I'm going to start diving into the technical details of neural networks so that you can apply them to modern-day machine learning applications and get them to work well on problems. But for me, one of the reasons they excite me is that maybe they give us this window into what we might do if we're also thinking of what algorithms might someday be able to learn in manners similar to humans can. In this video, I want to start telling you about how we represent neural networks. In other words, how we represent our hypothesis or how we represent our model when using neural networks. Neural networks were developed as simulating neurons or networks of neurons in the brain. So to explain the hypothesis representation, let's start by looking at what a single neuron in the brain looks like. Your brain and mine is jam-packed full of neurons like these, and neurons are cells in the brain. And the two things to draw attention to are that first, the neuron has a cell body like so, and moreover, the neuron has a number of input wires, and these are called the dendrites. You think of them as input wires, and these receive inputs from other locations. And the neuron also has an output wire called the axon, and this output wire is what it uses to send signals to other neurons, or to send messages to other neurons. So at a simplistic level, what a neuron is a computational unit that gets a number of inputs through its input wires, does some computation, and then it sends outputs via its axon to other nodes or to other neurons in the brain. Here's an illustration of a group of neurons. The way that neurons communicate with each other is with little pulses of electricities. They're also called spikes, but that just means a little pulse of electricity. So here's one neuron, and what it does is, if it wants to send a message, what it does is it sends a little pulse of electricity via its axon to some different neuron. And here, this axon, that is this output wire, connects to the input wire, connects to the dendrite of this second neuron over here, which then accepts this incoming message, does some computation, and may in turn decide to send out its own messages on its axon to other neurons. And this is the process by which all human thought happens, is these neurons doing computations and passing messages to other neurons as a result of what other inputs they got. And by the way, this is how our sensors and our muscles work as well. If you want to move one of your muscles, the way that works is that the neuron may send these pulses of electricities to your muscle, and that causes your muscles to contract. And your eyes, if some sensor like your eye wants to send a message to your brain, what it does is it sends these pulses of electricity to a neuron in your brain, like so. In a neural network, or rather in an artificial neural network that we implement in a computer, we're going to use a very simple model of what a neuron does. We're going to model a neuron as just a logistic unit. So when I draw a yellow circle like that, you should think of that as playing a role analogous to maybe the body of a neuron, and we then feed the neuron a few inputs via its dendrites or its input wires. And the neuron does some computation and outputs some value on its output wire, or in the biological neuron, this was the axon. And whenever I draw a diagram like this, what this means is that this represents a computation of h of x equals 1 over 1 plus e to the negative theta transpose x, where as usual, x and theta are our parameter vectors, like so. So this is a very simple, maybe vastly oversimplified model of the computation that the neuron does, where it gets a number of inputs, x1, x2, x3, and it outputs some value computed like so. When I draw a neural network, usually I draw only the input nodes x1, x2, x3. Sometimes when it's useful to do so, I'll draw an extra node for x0. This x0 node is sometimes called the bias unit or the bias neuron. But because x0 is always equal to 1, sometimes I draw it and sometimes I won't, just depending on whatever is more notationally convenient for that example. Finally, one last bit of terminology. When we talk about neural networks, sometimes we'll say that this is a neuron, or an artificial neuron, with a sigmoid or a logistic activation function. So this activation function in the neural network terminology, this is just another term for that function, for that non-linearity g of z, equals 1 over 1 plus e to the negative z. And whereas so far I've been calling theta the parameters of the model, I'll mostly continue to use that terminology to call theta the parameters. But in neural networks, in the neural network literature, sometimes you might hear people talk about weights of a model, and weights just means exactly the same thing as parameters of a model. But I'll mostly continue to use the terminology parameters in these videos, but sometimes you may hear others use the weights terminology. So this little diagram represents a single neuron. What a neural network is just a group of these different neurons strung together. Concretely, here we have input units x1, x2, x3, and once again, sometimes we can draw this extra node x0 and sometimes not, so just draw that in here. And here we have 3 neurons, which I've written, A21, A22, A23. I'll talk about those indices later. And once again, we can, if we want, add in this A0 and add an extra bias unit there. That always outputs the value of 1. And then finally, we have this third node at the final layer, and there's this third node that outputs the value that our hypothesis h of x computes. To introduce a bit more terminology, in a neural network, the first layer, this is also called the input layer, because this is where we input our features, x1, x2, x3. The final layer is also called the output layer, because that layer has the neuron, this one over here, that outputs the final value computed by a hypothesis. And then layer 2 in between, this is called the hidden layer. The term hidden layer isn't a great terminology, but the intuition is that in supervised learning, where you get to see the inputs and you get to see the correct outputs, whereas the hidden layer are values you don't get to observe in the training set. So if it's not x, then it's not y, and so we call those hidden. And later on, we'll see neural networks with more than one hidden layer, But in this example, we have one input layer, layer 1, one hidden layer, layer 2, and one output layer, layer 3. But basically anything that isn't an input layer and isn't an output layer is called a hidden layer. So I want to be really clear about what this neural network is doing. Let's step through the computational steps that are embodied by this, represented by this diagram. To explain the specific computations represented by a neural network, here's a little bit more notation. I'm going to use A superscript J subscript I to denote the activation of neuron I or of unit I in layer J. So concretely, this A superscript 2 subscript 1, that's the activation of the first unit in layer 2, in our hidden layer. And by activation, I just mean, the value that is computed by and that is output by a specific. In addition, our neural network is parameterized by these matrices theta superscript j, where theta j is going to be a matrix of weights controlling the function mapping from one layer, maybe the first layer to the second layer, or from the second layer to the third layer. So here are the computations that are represented by this diagram. This first hidden unit here has its value computed as follows. A21 is equal to the sigmoid function, or the sigmoid activation function, also called the logistic activation function, applied to this sort of linear combination of its inputs. And then this second hidden unit has its activation value computed as sigmoid of this, and similarly for this third hidden unit is computed by that formula. So here we have 3 input units and 3 hidden units, and so the dimension of theta 1, which is the matrix of parameters governing our mapping from our 3 input units to our 3 hidden units, theta 1 is going to be a 3 theta 1 is going to be a 3 by 4 dimensional matrix. And more generally, if a network has Sj units in layer J and Sj plus 1 units in layer J plus 1, then the matrix theta j, which governs the function mapping from layer J to layer J plus 1, that will have dimension Sj plus 1 by Sj plus 1. Just be clear about this notation, right? This is S subscript j plus 1, and that's S subscript j, and then this whole thing plus 1. This whole thing Sj plus 1. Okay, so that's S subscript j plus 1 plus by so that's S subscript j plus 1 by Sj plus 1, where this plus 1 is not part of the subscript. Okay, so we've talked about what the 3 hidden units do to compute their values. Finally, this final, in the output layer, we have one more unit which computes h of x, and that's equal, can also be written as A31, and that's equal to this. And you notice that I've written this with a superscript 2 here, because theta superscript 2 is the matrix of parameters, or the matrix of weights, that controls the function that maps from the hidden units, that is the layer 2 units, to the 1 layer 3 unit, that is the output unit. To summarize, what we've done is shown how a picture like this over here defines an artificial neural network which defines a function h that maps from x's input values to hopefully to some space of predictions y. And these hypotheses are parameterized by parameters that I'm denoting with capital theta, so that as we vary theta, we get different hypotheses, so we get different functions mapping, say, from x to y. So this gives us a mathematical definition of how to represent the hypothesis in a neural network. In the next few videos, what I'd like to do is give you more intuition about what these hypothesis representations do, as well as go through a few examples and talk about how to compute them efficiently. In the last video, we gave a mathematical definition of how to represent or how to compute the hypothesis used by a neural network. In this video, I'd like to show you how to actually carry out that computation efficiently, and that is show you a vectorized implementation. And second, and more importantly, I want to start giving you intuition about why these neural network representations might be a good idea and how they can help us to learn complex nonlinear hypotheses. Consider this neural network. Previously, we said that the sequence of steps we need in order to compute the output of a hypothesis is these equations given on the left, where we compute the activation values of the 3 hidden units, and then we use those to compute the final output of our hypothesis, h of x. Now, I'm going to define a few extra terms. So this term that I'm underlining here, I'm going to define that to be z superscript 2 subscript 1, so that we have that a21, which is this term, is equal to g of z21. And by the way, these superscript 2, what that means is that this z2 and this a2 as well, the superscript 2 in parentheses means that these are values associated with layer 2, that is with the hidden layer in the neural network. Now, this term here, I'm going to similarly define as z22, and finally this last term here that I'm underlining, let me define that as z23, so that similarly we have a23 equals g of z23. So these z values are just a linear combination, a weighted linear combination of the input values x0, x1, x2, x3 that go into a particular neuron. Now, if you look at this block of numbers, you may notice that that block of numbers corresponds suspiciously similar to the matrix vector operation, matrix vector multiplication of x1 times the vector x. Using this observation, we're going to be able to vectorize this computation of the neural network. Concretely, let's define the feature vector x as usual to be the vector of x0, x1, x2, x3, where x0 as usual is always equal to 1. And let's define z2 to be the vector of these z values of z21, z22, z23. Notice that there z2, this is a 3-dimensional vector. We can now vectorize the computation of a21, a22, a23 as follows. We can just write this in 2 steps. We can compute z2 as theta1 times x, and that would give us this vector z2. And then a2 is g of z2. And just to be clear, z2 here, this is a 3-dimensional vector, and a2 is also a 3-dimensional vector, and thus this activation g, this applies the sigmoid function element-wise to each of z2's elements. And by the way, to make our notation a little more consistent with what we'll do later, in this input layer we have the inputs x, but we can also think of this as the activations of the first layer. So if I define a1 to be equal to x, so the a1 is a vector, I can now take this x here and replace this with z2 equals theta1 times a1, just by defining a1 to be activations in my input layer. Now, with what I've written so far, I've now gotten myself the values for a1, a2, a3, and really I should put the superscripts there as well. But I need one more value, which is I also want this a0 to, and that corresponds to a bias unit in the hidden layer that goes to the output layer. Of course, there was a bias unit here too that I just didn't draw on earlier. But to take care of this extra bias unit, what we're going to do is add an extra a0 superscript 2 that's equal to 1. And after taking this step, we now have that a2 is going to be a 4-dimensional feature vector because we just added this extra, a0, which is equal to 1, corresponding to the bias unit in the hidden layer. And finally, to compute the actual value output of our hypothesis, we then simply need to compute z3. So z3 is equal to this term here that I'm just underlining. This inner term here is z3, and z3 is theta2 times a2, and finally my hypothesis output is h of x, which is a3. That's the activation of my one and only unit in the output layer. So that's just a real number. You can write it as A3 or as A31, and that's G of Z3. This process of computing h of x is also called forward propagation, and it's called that because we start off with the activations of the input units, and then we sort of forward propagate that to the hidden layer and compute the activations of the hidden layer, and then we sort of forward propagate that and compute the activations of the output layer. But this process of computing the activations from the input, then the hidden, then the output layer, that's also called forward propagation. And what we just did was we worked out a vectorized implementation of this procedure. So if you implement it using these equations that we have on the right, this will give you an efficient way, a relatively efficient way of computing h of x. This forward propagation view also helps us to understand what neural networks might be doing and why they might help us to learn interesting nonlinear hypotheses. Consider the following neural network, and let's say I cover up the left part of this picture for now. If you look at what's left in this picture, this looks a lot like logistic regression, where what we're doing is we're using that node, that's just a logistic regression unit, and we're using that to make a prediction h of x. And concretely, what the hypothesis is outputting is h of x is going to be equal to g, which is my sigmoid activation function, times theta 0 times a0, which is equal to 1, plus theta 1 plus theta 2 times a2 plus theta 3 times a3, where the values a1, a2, a3 are those given by these three hidden units. Now, to be actually consistent with our earlier notation, I actually would need to fill in these superscript 2's here. I guess need to fill in these superscript 2's everywhere. And I also have these indices 1 there because I have only one output unit. But if you focus on the blue parts of the notation, this is, this looks awfully like the standard logistic regression model, except that I now have a capital theta instead of lowercase theta. But and what this is doing is just logistic regression, but where the features fed into logistic regression are these values computed by the hidden layer. Just to say that again, what this neural network is doing is just like logistic regression, except that rather than using the original features x1, x2, x3, is using these new features a1, a2, a3. Again, you could put the superscripts there to be consistent with the notation. And the cool thing about this is that the features a1, a2, a3, they themselves are learned as functions of the input. Concretely, the function mapping from layer 1 to layer 2, that is determined by some other set of parameters, theta 1. So it's as if the neural network, instead of being constrained to feed the features x1, x2, x3 to logistic regression, it gets to learn its own features, a1, a2, a3, to feed into logistic regression. And as you can imagine, depending on what parameters it chooses for theta 1, you can learn some pretty interesting and complex features, and therefore you can end up with a better hypothesis than if you were constrained to use the raw features x1, x2, x3, or if you were constrained to, say, choose the polynomial terms, x1, x2, x2, x3, and so on. But instead, this algorithm has the flexibility to try to learn whatever features it wants using these a1, a2, a3 in order to feed into this loss unit that's essentially a logistic regression unit. I realize this example is described at a somewhat high level, and so I'm not sure if this intuition of the neural network having more complex features will quite make sense yet. But if it doesn't yet, in the next 2 videos I'm going to go through a specific example of how a neural network can use its hidden layer to compute more complex features to feed into its final output layer, and how that can learn more complex hypotheses. So in case what I'm saying here doesn't quite make sense, stick with me for the next 2 videos, and hopefully after working through those examples, this explanation will make a little bit more sense. But just to point out, you can have neural networks with other types of diagrams as well. And the way that neural networks are connected, that's called the architecture. So the term architecture refers to how the different neurons are connected to each other. this is an example of a different neural network architecture. And once again, you may be able to get this intuition of how the second layer, here we have 3 hidden units that are computing some complex function maybe of the input layer, and then the third layer can take the second layer's features and compute even more complex features in layer 3, so that by the time you get to the output layer, layer 4, you can have even more complex features of what you were able to compute in layer 3, and so get very interesting nonlinear hypotheses. By the way, in a network like this, layer 1, this is called an input layer, layer 4 is still our output layer, and this network has 2 hidden layers. So anything that's not a input layer or an output layer is called a hidden layer. So hopefully from this video you've gotten a sense of how the feed-forward propagation step in a neural network works, where you start from the activations of the input layer and forward propagate that to the first hidden layer, then the second hidden layer, and then finally the output layer. And you also saw how we can vectorize that computation. In the next, I realized that some of the intuitions in this video of how other certain layers are computing complex features of the early layers, I realized some of that intuition may be still slightly abstract and kind of at a high level. And so what I'd like to do in the next 2 videos is work through a detailed example of how a neural network can be used to compute nonlinear functions of the input, and hopefully that will give you a good sense of the sorts of complex nonlinear hypotheses we can get out of neural networks. In this and the next video, I want to work through a detailed example showing how a neural network can compute a complex nonlinear function of the input. And hopefully this will give you a good sense of why neural networks can be used to learn complex nonlinear hypotheses. Consider the following problem where we have input features x1 and x2 that are binary values, so either 0 or 1. So x1 and x2 can each take on only one of 2 possible values. In this example, I've drawn only 2 positive examples and 2 negative examples, but you can think of this as a simplified version of a more complex learning problem where we may have a bunch of positive examples to the upper right and the lower left, and a bunch of negative examples denoted by the circles. And what we'd like to do is learn a nonlinear decision boundary that maybe just separates the positive and the negative examples. So how can a neural network do this? And rather than use an example on the right, I'm going to use this maybe easier to examine example on the left. Concretely, what this is really computing the target label y equals x1 xor x2, or actually this is actually the x1 xnor x2 function, where xnor is the alternative notation for not x1 or x2. So x1 xor x2, that's true only if exactly one of x1 or x2 is equal to 1. It turns out that the specific example I'm going to use works out a little bit better if we use the xnor example instead. These two are the same, of course. It means not x1 xor x2, and so we're going to have positive examples if either both are true or both are false, and we'll have that's y equals 1, and we're going to have y equals 0 if only one of them is true. And we want to figure out if we can get a neural network to fit to this sort of training set. In order to build out to a network that fits the xnor example, we're going to start with a slightly simpler one and show a network that fits the AND function. Concretely, let's say we have input x1 and x2 that are again binary, so it's either 0 or 1, and let's say our target labels y are is equal to x1 and x2. This is a logical AND. So can we get a 1-unit network to compute this logical AND function? In order to do so, I'm going to actually draw in the bias unit as well, the +1 unit. Now, let me just assign some values to the weights or the parameters of this network. I'm going to write down the parameters on this diagram, right? -30 here, +20, and +20. And what this means is that I'm assigning a value of -30 to the value associated with x0, that is this +1 going into this unit, and a parameter value of +20 that multiplies into x1, and a value of +20 for the parameter that multiplies into x2. So concretely, this is saying that my hypothesis h of x is equal to g of minus 30 plus 20x1 plus 20x2. So sometimes it's just convenient to draw these weights, or draw these parameters up here, in the diagram of the neural network. And of course, this minus 30, this is actually theta 1 of 1, 0. This is theta 1 of 1, 1, and that's theta 1 of 1, 2. But it's just easier to think about it as, associating these parameters with the edges of the network. Let's look at what this little single neuron network will compute. Just to remind you, the sigmoid activation function g of z looks like this. It starts from 0, rises smoothly, crosses 0.5, and then it asymptotes at 1. And to give you some landmarks, if the horizontal axis value z is equal to 4.6, then the sigmoid function is equal to 0.99. This is very close to 1. And kind of symmetrically, if it's negative 4.6, then the sigmoid function there is equal to 0.01. This is very close to 0. Let's look at the 4 possible input values for x1 and x2 and look at what our hypothesis will output in that case. If x1 and x2 are both equal to 0, if you look at this, if x1 and x2 are both equal to 0, then the hypothesis will output g of negative 30. So it's going to be very far to the left of this diagram, so it'll be very close to 0. If x1 equals 0 and x2 equals 1, then this formula here evaluates to g, that is the sigmoid function applied to minus 10. And again, that's to the far left of this plot, and so that's again very close to 0. This is also g of minus 10, that is if x1 is equal to 1 and x2 is 0, this is minus 30 plus 20, which is minus 10. And finally, if x1 equals 1, x2 equals 1, then you have g of minus 30 plus 20 plus 20. So that's g of positive 10, which is therefore very close to 1. And if you look in this column, this is exactly the logical AND function. So this is computing h of x is, approximately x1 and x2. In other words, it outputs 1 if and only if x1 and x2 are both equal to 1. So by writing out our little truth table like this, we managed to figure out what's the logical function that our little neural network computes. This network shown here computes the OR function. Just to show you how I work that out, if you write out the hypothesis, you find that it's computing g of minus 10 plus 20x1 plus 20x2, and so if you fill in these values, you find that that's g of minus 10, which is approximately 0, g of 10, which is approximately 1, and so on. And these are approximately 1, and these numbers is essentially the logical OR function. So hopefully with this, you now understand how single neurons in a neural network can be used to compute logical functions like AND and OR and so on. In the next video, we'll continue building on these examples and work through a more complex example. We'll get to show you how a neural network now with multiple layers of units can be used to compute more complex functions like the XOR function or the XNOR function. In this video, I'd like to keep working through our example to show how a neural network can compute complex nonlinear hypotheses. In the last video, we saw how a neural network can be used to compute the functions x1 and x2 and the function x1 or x2 when x1 and x2 are binary, that is, when they take on values in 0, 1. We can also have a network to compute negation, that is, to compute the function not x1. Let me just write down the weights associated with this network. We have only one input feature, x1 in this case, and the bias unit plus 1. And if I associate this with the weights plus 10 and minus 20, then my hypothesis is computing this. H of x equals sigmoid of 10 minus 20 times x1. So when x1 is equal to 0, my hypothesis will be computing g of 10 minus 20 times 0, which is just 10, And so that's approximately 1. And when x is equal to 1, this will be g of minus 10, which is therefore approximately equal to 0. And if you look at what these values are, that's essentially the not x1 function. So to include negations, the general idea is to put a large negative weight in front of the variable you want to negate. So if there's minus 20 multiplied by x1, and that's the general idea of how you end up negating x1. And so in an example that I hope you will figure out yourself, if you want to compute a function like this, not x1 and not x2, well, part of that would probably be putting large negative weights in front of x1 and x2, but it should be feasible to get a neural network with just one output unit to compute this as well. Right? And so this logical function not x1 and not x2 is going to be equal to 1 if and only if x1 equals x2 equals 0, right? So this is a logical function that says not x1, that means x1 must be 0, and not x2, that means x2 must be equal to 0 as well. So this logical function is equal to 1 if and only if both x1 and x2 are equal to 0. And hopefully you should be able to figure out how to make a small neural network to compute this logical function as well. Now, taking the three pieces that we have put together, that is the network for computing x1 and x2, and the network for computing not x1 and not x2, and one last network for computing x1 or x2, we should be able to put these three pieces together to compute this x1, x0, x2 function. And just to remind you, if this was x1, x2, this function that we want to compute would have negative examples here and here, and we'd have positive examples there and there. And so clearly this will need a non-linear decision boundary in order to separate the positive and negative examples. Let's draw the network. I'm going to take my input plus 1, x1, x2, and create my first hidden unit here. I'm going to call this A21 because that's my first hidden unit. And I'm going to copy the weights over from the red network, the x1 and x2 networks. So I have minus 30, 20, 20. Next, let me create a second hidden unit, which I'm going to call A22. That is the second hidden unit of layer 2. And I'm going to copy over the cyan network in the middle. So I have the weights 10, minus 20, minus 20. And so let's fill in some of the truth table values. For the red network, we know that was computing the x1 and x2. And so this will be approximately 0, 0, 0, 1, depending on the values of x1 and x2. And for A22, this the cyan network, well, we know the function not x1 and not x2, that outputs 1, 0, 0, 0 for the four values of x1 and x2. Finally, I'm going to create my output node, my output unit, that is A31. This is what will output h of x. And I'm going to copy over the O network for that. And I'm going to need a +1 bias unit here, so draw that in. And I'm going to copy over the weights from the green network, so that's minus 10, 20, 20. And we know earlier that this computes the O function. So let's fill in the truth table entries. For the first entry is 0 or 1, which is only 1. Then next 0 or 0, which is 0, 0 or 0, which is 0, 1 or 0, and that alls to 1. And thus, h of x is equal to 1 when either both x1 and x2 are 0, or when x1 and x2 are both 1. And concretely, h of x outputs 1 exactly at these two locations, and it outputs 0 otherwise. And thus, with this neural network, which has an input layer, one hidden layer, and one output layer, we end up with a nonlinear decision boundary that computes this x0 function. And the more general intuition is that in the input layer, we just had our raw inputs. Then we had our hidden layer, which computed some slightly more complex functions of the inputs that is shown here. So slightly more complex functions. And then by adding yet another layer, we end up with an even more complex nonlinear function. And this is the sort of intuition about why neural networks can compute pretty complicated functions. that when you have multiple layers, you have relatively simple function of the input to the second layer, but the third layer can build on that to compute even more complex functions, and then the layer after that can compute even more complex functions. To wrap up this video, I want to show you a fun example of an application of a neural network that captures this intuition of the deeper layers computing more complex features. I want to show you a video that I got from a good friend of mine, Jan Kuhn. Jan is a professor at New York University at NYU, and he was one of the early pioneers of neural network research and is sort of a legend in the field now, and his ideas are used in sort of all sorts of products and applications throughout the world now. So I want to show you a video from some of his early work in which he was using a neural network to recognize handwriting, to do handwritten digit recognition. You might remember early in this class, at the start of this class, I said that one of the early successes of neural networks was trying to use it to read zip codes to help to help us send mail along, so read postal codes. So this is one of the attempts. This is one of the algorithms used to try to address that problem. In the video that I'll show you, this area here is the input area that shows a handwritten character shown to the network. This column here shows a visualization of the features computed by sort of the first hidden layer of the network. And so the first hidden layer, this visualization shows different features, different edges and lines and so on detected. This is a visualization of the next hidden layer. It's kind of harder to see, kind of hard to understand the deeper hidden layers, and that's the visualization of what the next hidden layer is computing. You probably have a hard time seeing what's going on, much beyond the first hidden layer. But then finally, all of these learned features get fed to the output layer, and shown over here is the final answer. It's the final predictive value for what handwritten digit the neural network thinks that is being shown. So let's take a look at the video. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and that this hopefully gave you some intuition about the sorts of pretty complicated functions neural networks can learn, in which it takes as input this image, just takes as input the raw pixels, and the first hidden layer computes some set of features, the next hidden layer computes even more complex features and even more complex features, and these features can then be used by essentially the final layer of logistic regression classifiers to make accurate predictions about what are the numbers that the network sees. In this video, I want to tell you about how to use neural networks to do multi-class classification, where we may have more than one category that we're trying to distinguish amongst. In the last part of the last video, where we had the handwritten digit recognition problem, that was actually a multi-class classification problem because there were 10 possible categories for recognizing the digits from 0 through 9. And so here I want to fill you in on the details of how to do that. The way we do multi-class classification in a neural network is essentially an extension of the one versus all method. So let's say that we have a computer vision example where instead of just trying to recognize cause, as in the original example that I started off with, but let's say that we're trying to recognize 4 categories of objects. So given an image, we want to decide if it's a pedestrian, a car, a motorcycle, or a truck. If that's the case, what we would do is we would build a neural network with 4 output units so that our neural network now outputs a vector of 4 numbers. So the output now is actually going to be a vector of 4 numbers. And what we're going to try to do is get the first output unit to classify is the image a pedestrian, yes or no. The second unit to classify is the image a car, yes or no. This unit to classify is the image a motorcycle, yes or no, and this to classify is the image a truck, yes or no. And thus, when the image is of a pedestrian, we would ideally want the network to output 1000. When it's a car, we want it to output 0100. When it's a motorcycle, we get it to, or rather we want it to output 0010, and so on. So this is just like the one versus all method that we talked about when we were describing logistic regression. And here we have essentially 4 logistic regression classifiers, each of which is trying to recognize one of the 4 classes that we want to distinguish amongst. So rearranging the slide a bit, here's our neural network with 4 output units, and those are what we want h of x to be when we have the different images. And the way we're going to represent the training set in these settings is as follows. So when we have a training set with different images of pedestrians, cars, motorcycles, and trucks, what we're going to do in this example is that whereas previously we had written out the labels as y being an integer from 1, 2, 3, or 4, instead of representing y this way, we're going to instead represent y as follows. Namely, yi will be either 1000 or 0100 or 010 or 001, depending on what the corresponding image xi is. And so one training example will be one pair xi comma yi, where xi is an image with one of the 4 objects, and yi will be one of these vectors. And hopefully we can find a way to get our neural network to output some value so that h of x is approximately y. And both h of x and yi, both of these are going to be, in our example, 4-dimensional vectors when we have 4 classes. So that's how you get a neural network to do multi-class classification. This wraps up our discussion on how to represent neural networks, that is on our hypothesis representation. In the next set of videos, let's start to talk about how to take a training set and how to automatically learn the parameters of the neural network.